The chapel smelled of lilies and lemon oil. Someone had swept the wooden pews until they shone, and string lights hung like captive stars. I had chosen a navy dress, the way I have chosen everything for the last 15 years. Modest, well-cut, utterly unremarkable. A woman in a crowd should be allowed to be invisible if she wants to be. That was my rule. Thomas always teased me about it. "You're our secret philanthropist," he would say, eye soft. But he loved the quiet as much as I did. Tonight, I wanted quiet. I sat, palms folded, listening to the minister speak about promises. The orchestra behind him softened at the right moments. My son Dylan looked like someone he had always been, sincere, a little overwhelmed, proud enough to faint if anyone mentioned his father. Jessica, bride, smile, practiced laugh, floated down the aisle like a polished portrait from an upscale magazine. Her dress caught the light and held it like a secret. Her jewels actually reflected sunlight. I noticed those details the way one notices shipping labels on surface mail. Useful, not to be admired. Then, in the middle of a photograph, a small business of cruelty happened. She was standing beside the guests at the front, greeting people as they came forward to congratulate them. She passed within reach. Her hand briefly touched mine, formal, quick, and she tilted her head with that half-smile I'd learned to read over the years. Appraisal, then dismissal. "You must be Dylan's mother," she said loudly enough for the row to hear, her tone theatrical and just a half-beat too sharp. "I love that you look classic, like someone's grandmother at a fundraiser." There it was. A laugh rolled through the assembled faces, some awkward, some amused. I could feel Dylan's hand tighten on his new wife's elbow. I could feel my own pulse respond not with fear, but with a small, cold clarity. Embarrassment, briefly. I had always thought public remarks would be the worst thing, picked apart like fabric. But some humiliations are designed to be public. They want witnesses. Others, more subtle, aim for the private brand of shame that eats at you quietly. This was public. This was a performance. Before I could decide whether to smile and let it pass, Robert Reynolds, Jessica's father, founder of the small electronics firm that had been the center of his life and the target of a certain anonymous bid years ago, looked up from his conversation on the other side of the aisle. His eyes tracked across the pews and froze. He didn't take the polite route of thanking or nodding. He pushed his way between people like someone who needed to get from one fact to another. Then he stopped short and stared at me and the man beside me. I had not meant to draw attention to the man sitting next to me. He was James Sullivan, my financial advisor, a straightforward man with soft gray hair and a voice like warm tea. He had come because I had asked him to, because I wanted someone sensible between the camera glare and me, someone to anchor the evening if Dylan's new family decided to make a spectacle. He had obliged without a word about my dress, and that saved him from ever hearing the kind of idle gossip I have long ignored. "Is that?" Robert's voice cracked. The hush that had followed Jessica's remark shifted into a different gear. Curiosity, then the scent of recognition. "Is that the man who bought Reynolds Electronics?" The tent of murmurs collapsed inward. A woman dropped her program. The photographer, who had been standing for the bridal party portraits, lowered his camera as if someone had told them they were under oath. Jessica's smile thinned into something sharp and then fractured entirely, as if electricity had struck a brittle thing. I remember feeling nothing for a second, as if I were watching someone else navigate the reaction. 15 years of careful invisibility were not built on a whim. They had been a practice. The kinds of trusts we use for privacy, the quiet investments, the names on papers kept at a distance, the decision to let Thomas be the one with the public face when he was alive. We had chosen the slow, boring route, the one that doesn't make good reading in magazines, but keeps family dinners from becoming applications for dependency. And tonight, in this chapel, someone had decided to unmask us with a casual, sharp sentence. Robert whispered something to his wife. For a moment, I thought he might faint. His face went the color of old maps. He turned to the nearest groomsman and said, loud enough that the whole front row could hear, "We sold the company. Who is she with?" The phrase landed differently than Jessica's insult. It was not a jibe. It was the sudden answer to a question he had probably been carrying around in his pocket for a decade. Who had been on the other side of that quiet transaction? It was the moment a rumor, kept as comfortable as a loose sleeve, became a known fact. The world requires witnesses to change people's minds, and Robert had just found one. People leaned in, as people always do when they sense a secret. There were a dozen staccato whispers, until one of the ushers, wanting to preserve decorum, cleared his throat and steered a camera toward the back. It was absurdly theatrical. Weddings always are, in the end, and awful, because none of the theatrics were mine. I had chosen anonymity. I had chosen quiet. I had not chosen the center of attention tonight. James placed his hand on my shoulder, a small, steadying thing. He gave me a look that said, "Remember who you are. Remember why." I nodded. That would have to be enough. Later, after vows and confetti and the formal photographs, people would replay this moment as if it were a turning point. Tonight, in heat and light and the sticky sweetness of champagne, it felt like a crack opening under my feet.
The guest list included people who had met me only through Thomas's stories. It included people who had never met me at all. If you're hearing this and thinking, why didn't she tell them? I understand the question. I used to ask it of myself, but the answer was always the same. We wanted Dylan's life to be his own. There's a certain cruelty that unearned fortune can inflict. Young people who grow up with the knowledge of a fortune they didn't earn sometimes drift on its surface like ships that never touch the shore. They miss storms that teach seamanship. Do I sound cold? Perhaps. There's a kind of maternal strategy that looks like coldness from the outside, but feels like armor from the inside. We wanted Dylan to row his own boat. After the ceremony, the reception was a bright, hot room of lacquered wood and linen napkins. The Reynolds family had spared no expense: a live band, plates that crunched with expensive salt, and centerpieces tall enough to obstruct uncomfortable conversations. I moved through the room the way I always have, quietly, making small talk, avoiding the microphone. I greeted old colleagues of Thomas who still remembered him for the crinkled way he smiled when he explained a new idea. I met people who assumed I had children of my own and were surprised that I was still young enough to have a son getting married. I felt their surprise the way you feel a cool breeze through an open car window. Then Jessica found me. She approached with the confidence of someone used to being the center of an orbit. Her face had that streak of white-hot indignation that people sometimes carry when a table challenge becomes personal. She stood too close, eyeing my silver earrings as if she could read an account balance in them. "So," she said, in that acid, bright way that hits the nerve and doesn't stay to hear the wound, "you're the mysterious investor everyone's been whispering about." I let the word hang. It felt like a spar being thrown. You don't always need to flinch at every insult. Sometimes letting it land on the floor gives you the chance to let others see the mess. She smiled, thin and meant for the room. How quaint. Her voice had that dangerous register people use when they mean to be both amused and superior. You could have at least worn something that matched the occasion. There it was again, the insistence that money should announce itself. She wanted diamonds. She wanted a woman to be spectacular, and therefore easy to read. A story that fit in a magazine. She wanted a spectacle that would make her wedding more of a stage and less of a real life. "Jessica," I said softly, because there were babies within hearing distance, and because my son was nearby, and because I was old enough to remember the dishes my mother washed after I'd behaved badly. "This isn't about clothes. It's about honesty," she insisted. "People deserve to know who's influencing things. Did you think nobody would ever find out?" She thought she had found a weakness: secrecy. Perhaps she had a point. Secrets, no matter how carefully wrapped, have a tendency to fray if someone pulls hard enough. I answered her the way I always have when the thing at stake was my family, with clarity and without theatrics. "Dylan is my son," I said. "We did not hide money from him out of malice. We made a choice we thought would protect him." Somewhere between the speakers and the dessert table, someone else had overheard. A man who had been in the same industry as Thomas, who had owed him a favor long ago, came over and put his hand on Jessica's arm, murmuring something like, "You should speak to them, there's a story." He was smiling in the way of people who like a good plot. It would have been tolerable, an awkward, private thing, if not for the way Jessica's eyes flashed then. She is younger than Dylan by a few years, and the world has primed her to win things. When someone steps into her path, she challenges them. She has a habit of digging until she finds something to complain about, and then she frames complaints as evidence of virtue. It's a neat trick. It's one I saw used back at the boardroom where Thomas once pitched an early prototype. Find the smallest inconsistency, blow it up into a moral imperative. After the reception began in earnest, Dylan approached me with a look I did not know how to read. His face had that edge of strain, like someone carrying two things at once and worrying one would slip. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice barely getting past the violinist, "is any of this true? Are you—" He didn't finish. I understood why he couldn't. It's different to suspect a thing and different to hear it in the room where your life is being celebrated. How do you reconcile the man you are about to marry with the idea that the person you love most carries a secret that could, if mishandled, feel like a betrayal? This is the moment when most people expect drama. They want to be told I stood on a table and delivered a speech about dignity, or that I called Jessica out for impropriety. I did neither. I sat down with my son in a corner by the buffet where the lighting was mercifully dim, and I said what I always say when the stakes are highest, the truth in its simplest form. "Dylan," I said, placing my hand over his. The crowd around us flowed like a river, oblivious to the dam forming in our small space. "There are things I never told you because I wanted you to stand on your own. Thomas and I built a life without announcing it. We kept our finances private. You grew up the person we wanted you to be, without our shadow. If that feels like a betrayal now, I am sorry." He stared at me. The bride had a smile that was becoming a forced thing. His new father-in-law hovered nearby, as if the revelation were a meteor and he was waiting for fragments. Dylan said nothing for a long beat. Then he asked, in a voice that had a small, brittle edge, "Why would you hide it?"
Who did you think this was protecting? The honest answer, what I felt in my chest, was fear. Not fear of money, but fear of what money can do to a son's sense of self. But to give him that answer would be to explain the calculus of parenting and sacrifice. It would be a sermon, and he needed something else. "We wanted you to be known for yourself," I said. "We wanted you to have choices that felt like yours." He looked away. For a long moment, he walked the edge between two lives, the one he'd inhabited, quiet and unquestioned, and the one the revelation suddenly suggested, lives rearranged by women with magazines and men with public faces. He laughed then, but it was a laughter that had a thing like fright in it. "I don't know what to think," he said. "I don't know how to process this." If I had to pick one regret about that night, it was that I let the conversation end there. We both knew parenting isn't a single truth you hand over like a sealed letter. I should have made time to sit with him afterward, to say more, to be more explicit about the choices we'd made. But the wedding is a machine of obligation. Photos, toasts, 1,000 people wanting assurances and the illusion of permanence. We are given a few hours to set a life into a picture frame, and then the frame is handed to others to judge. The next morning, when the house was quiet and the leftovers humored the dogs, Dylan called. He asked for time to think. He didn't know, he said, where he stood. He had been embarrassed at the reception, he confessed quietly, because the revelation felt like a public weighing, an eyebrow raised at our family. He wanted to know what it meant for his career, for the perception of competence in front of colleagues, for his future. It was the beginning of something I had feared but somehow told myself would not happen. Our privacy, intended as armor, was now a kind of tinder. People sniffed the air for its scent. Then, within days, small things began to appear. An online profile with a few too many guesses about who the anonymous investor might be. A photo of James at a conference, smiling, captioned as if he'd been photographed leaving a closed meeting. A comment here, a forwarded link there, pieces of a jigsaw assembled by hands that hate to be patient. I tried to ignore these tendrils the way you ignore a mole you assume will never be malignant. But it spread. And Jessica, she did not wait to be patient. She does not believe in small gestures. She believes in acting quickly and with force. The week after the wedding, I received an email, not rude but precise, from a lawyer I did not recognize. It requested clarification about recent financial transfers and asked whether I would be willing to sit down and clear the air about any potential overlaps between family obligations and outside investments. The tone was courteous. The content was a thinly veiled demand. I responded to Thames instead of the lawyer. "Is this harassment?" I asked him over the phone because James is very practical the way some people are very religious, calm, steady, and used to being consulted at odd hours. "It's not harassment yet," he said, "but there's interest. You're being looked at in a way you haven't been looked at before. People are curious, and some of them are aggressive in how they pursue that curiosity. Let me do some checking." That was the moment I felt the old strategy unspool. People will say that secrecy is impossible in the modern era. They are right in a sense. Information leaks, it creeps like damp. But secrecy as a deliberate choice is still possible if you have the discipline to maintain it and the means to defend it. That discipline doesn't mean you become unaccountable. It means you make choices about where vulnerability must live. I had choices to make now. Do I step forward and announce what we had done, openly, with a press release, with interviews, in the full glare of light? Or do I continue to shield my son and let others interpret the shadow as they will? Both options have costs.
Meanwhile, Jessica's small moves became larger. She began to ask troublesome questions in family conversations, innocuous at first, but like a skewer under a roast. Who exactly is helping with this? Where did that donation appear from? And people who'd always deferred to her father's charm began to look sideways. A private investigator named Aguilar, who liked to send invoices with detailed timestamps, appeared in my inbox because someone had asked him to canvass public records. I did not open the invoice. I closed my eyes and counted to 10, remembering a line Thomas used to use when the world seemed like a bad math problem. Treatment and response. Treat the issue as it is, respond as it requires. There are, in these situations, two kinds of energy: the energy of offense, of blowing the matter up until you've won the argument, and the energy of protection, of building a scaffold so the people you love are not harmed by the noise. I had always chosen the latter. I believed then, and I believe now, that a pragmatic settlement of a quarrel, one that protects a son's career, a family's dignity, and the chance to continue doing work that mattered, was not cowardice, it was stewardship. But I will admit, fierce as I am when it comes to my son, the moment Jessica began to dig in with lawyers and insinuations, something cold and old in me made the calculation that we would not be able to let this go on without defense. That decision is why James began to gather names, and why I asked him to start a careful record of interactions. I asked him to be discreet. I did not ask him to do anything unethical. I asked him to be thorough, to note dates, to keep copies. When I said we must be above reproach, I meant it.
The first time I saw the private investigator's name in plain print, Aguilar, I felt a soundless grief, the kind that arrives like a small stone hitting water and expanding into a wide circle of consequences. So many good evenings of my life had been arranged around the notion that I could care for my son by staying out of the limelight. Now that limelight had a hunger for answers it would not be satisfied without paying for them. And for the first time since Thomas died, I felt the old, steady anger I'd kept in the chest like a coin. Not anger at Jessica personally. She is her own person, with fears and ambitions and reasons for being sharp. But anger at the system that rewards spectacle above substance, at the readiness of people to weaponize privacy as if it were a moral failing. I was not ashamed of what we had done. I had no appetite for a public theater of shame. I wanted repair. I wanted my son to have a career that felt his, rather than a story about a son living in his parents' shadow. So I did what I always do when something needs to be fixed. I started to organize. I called James back. I asked him to do the practical things. Document the emails, the lawyer's contact, any public filings that referenced my name or the trusts. He reminded me, in his calm way, to temper emotion with evidence. We don't want to be reactionary, he said. We want to be undeniable and measured. They are loud, we will be precise. That precision matters because when people accuse with partial information, the truth can be messy and, paradoxically, easier to weaponize. I would not give anyone the satisfaction of improvisation. My method, always, is to prepare. There was an act of small, ironic cruelty that followed. A local blog ran a piece, anonymous writer, clickbait headline, titled, "The Secret Buyer Who Upended Reynolds." The article was thin and error-prone, but talented at insinuation. Jessica, in her delight, forwarded it to Dylan with the comment, "See, we were right to be curious." He sent it back to me with no comment, just a string of 3 question marks. I knew then that he was not only contending with external facts, he was contending with a fracture between his life before and after knowledge. The knowledge had not even been processed, and already people were slicing it into narratives for their consumption. I thought about what Thomas would have done. He hated spectacle as much as I did. He favored simple, stubborn fixes. Fix the hardware, eliminate the noise, move forward. But he also understood theater. He'd say, if they want a show, give them a good script. I did not want to give them a show, but I also did not want to let them think their footnote would dictate our story. So I made a decision in that thin, private margin where mothers live. I would tell Dylan the whole truth, not to shame him or to control his future, but to offer him the chance to make a choice about who he wanted to be in the new reality.
If he wanted to distance himself, I would be sorrowful but accept it. If he wanted to stand with me, then he would stand knowing the cost. We arranged to meet in a small cafe near his office the following week. It was the kind of place where the light makes a polite apology before fading, where the waiters know your face after the second visit and don't ask too many questions. The city outside had the late summer heat of anyone trying to delay fall. He arrived early, hands rubbed together, as if he had been trying to warm his decisions. "Mom," he said, sitting down. His voice carried something like a child's plea. "Tell me everything. It is an odd thing to have someone ask you for the map you gave them without a compass.
For 15 years, I had applied layers to that map: trusts, advisors, relocations of accounts, the anonymity of philanthropic gifts, because we wanted protection for Dylan. I explained, in the measured way a retired engineer explains a complicated design. Thomas invented a regulator essential to an industry. We sold a patent and invested carefully. We kept the details private so our lives wouldn't be up for auction. He listened, at first with the blank, stoic face of someone told a physics problem, then with the small, twitching edges of someone whose world is tilting. He asked about the accountant and whether he had been involved. He asked for numbers, but I refused to treat this like an exam. Names, not numbers, I said. You deserve to understand the who and the why. The how will complicate more than it will help. He wanted to know if he could trust the story. Did you do this to keep me from wanting things, he asked, or did you just not think I could manage them? Both, I answered. Part protection, part hope, part lack of confidence in my own parenting, perhaps. He laughed, a small, sad sound. We sat there a long time. The cafe hummed around us like a living thing, unconcerned with the old arrangements of people's hearts. After that conversation, things did not settle. They rippled, and Jessica, who had not been invited to the cafe meeting, and who had, by several accounts, crossed lines into active inquiry, changed her tone from curiosity to quiet aggression. She began to pursue us in that way spoiled by certainty do, politely, relentlessly, like someone determined to prove a hypothesis. The first formal contact from a law firm was, as I said, clinical. The second was even more worrying. The presence of Aguilar, the private investigator, whose invoice, marked in my name on a leaked email, had been forwarded into the wrong hands. That leaked email became a seed. People who dislike privacy see its manifestations and mistake them for lies. They are not the same thing. I tried to explain that to Dylan. I did not want to fight for the principle of secrecy so much as I wanted to fight for the principle of agency, our agency to decide how to live.
By the time the fall came, what had been a family matter had acquired the taste of public theater. People began to ask questions in the wrong places. Colleagues at Dylan's firm who had previously only known him for his work began to whisper about his real advantages. Jessica, emboldened by her parents and an early victory of attention, felt her position strengthen. I felt the old familiar ache of being seen by the world in the terms it favored, story instead of person. And so the conflict began to thicken. A letter here, an insinuation there, and the steady, grinding curiosity that always seems to feed on small disclosures. I would be lying if I said I did not feel some small thrill at being interesting. Who would not? But it was a base thrill, the kind you get from overhearing your name in a crowd. The fear under it was practical, that my son might lose his foothold because people assume his path was paved rather than hewn. I will tell you plainly, that fear drove me in ways you might not expect. It did not make me vindictive. It made me purposeful. It made me call lawyers not to humiliate, but to contain. It made me insist on evidence rather than rumor. It made me, perhaps for the first time in my life, prepare for a negotiation with other people's egos on the table. That is why James and I began to meet more. When I say we, I mean we. James with his files, me with my intention narrowed like a laser. We were not plotting any impropriety. We were preparing for the realistic possibility that people would weaponize curiosity in order to fracture a family that had made peace with quiet. We knew what was legal and what was not. We stayed inside those lines, because breaking them would only hand our enemies a victory they did not deserve. The day we moved from private discomfort to explicit conflict was ordinary enough. A luncheon with Jessica and her parents at a restaurant that served salads in ridiculous bowls. The food was competent, the conversation was not. Jessica arrived with a tablet showing a screen full of printouts, screenshots, news items, a family tree of sorts. She set the tablet down like a gauntlet. "Look," she said, not looking up. "I did my homework. I have receipts. People have been helpful. I just want to make sure there's no conflict, because if there is, I think Dylan deserves to know." Her parents watched, fanning themselves quietly in stereotypes of old money. Robert, who had once been amused by the thought of us as a buyer he couldn't see, now watched like a man watching a match be struck. You would think the danger would be obvious to everyone in the room. The weaponization of curiosity is a dangerous thing. But people like being on the side of knowledge. It comforts them. She slid a photograph across the table, a grainy photograph of James shaking hands with a man I did not recognize, taken years ago at a conference. Another frame showed a small nonprofit donation with my name in a different format.
It was all careful and clean. Facts, not lies. But facts can be made to feel like an indictment when framed that way. "Mom," Dylan said, before I could. His tone was controlled. His face was the face of someone trying to be fair to both people he loved.
What do you want me to know right now? I inhaled and gave him something like what I always give when the stakes are soft and the choice is sharp. The truth, kitey and human. I want you to know why we made the choices we did, I said. I want you to know we did it to protect you from noise, from the temptation to confuse privilege with identity. I want you to know, most of all, that your life is yours. Jessica smiled then, and it was the kind of smile aimed to lock the room into a certain conclusion. That's convenient, she said, but convenient isn't always honest. If you're so protective, why hide donations and then deny them in the open when asked? The room tilted. I could feel the waiter pause in his step with the salad bowl, as if the air itself were savoring the confrontation. I kept my voice the way I always keep it in important moments, low, steady, to give someone else room to do the dramatic work if they want it. Because, I answered simply, we thought privacy was kinder than spectacle. Her laugh was a brittle thing. Privacy, she said, or cover. I knew then, clockwise, like the hands of a watch, that we were at the point where choices become accusations. Jessica had chosen not merely curiosity, but to turn curiosity into a crusade. She had decided to pry. People like that always find allies, those hungry for a story, those who see a secret and think of leverage. We ate our salads. The conversation decanted into the polite aftertaste of something that had been rearranged. When we left, the air outside felt sharper, as if the lunch had taken the climate with it. Dylan walked with me to the car, his arm brushing mine in an old, reassuring way, but the next line in our lives had been split. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm, I made a list, not of assets, but of choices. How far would I go to protect my son's reputation? When is a settlement an act of protection, and when is it capitulation? There is no clean moral algorithm for these things. You choose based on the compass you have. Love for your child, sense of public good, desire not to be the spectacle someone wants you to be. I am not proud of wanting to avoid drama for the sake of dignity alone, but I will say this. I am proud of the way I have tried to keep our family whole, to be reasonable in the face of provocation, to refuse spectacle even if it meant swallowing a bitter taste. I did not want to be famous for what we'd quietly done. I wanted, as Thomas had wanted, to be useful in ways that mattered without needing applause. And yet, even as I said that, I could feel another thing sharpen inside me. Resolve. If we were to be pushed, we would respond.
That response would be careful, legal, and aimed at one goal: to stop the thing that would harm Dylan's future. We would not engage in theatrics. We would not be cruel in return. We would be deliberate. Later that week, I received a call from someone who works on the inside of regulatory inquiries. I refuse to name agencies because I do not want to give the impression of a lecture on how these things operate. Suffice it to say, curiosity, when fueled by a lawyer and a private investigator, can morph into regulatory interest. Letters can turn into inquiries. You may think that nothing will happen, but sometimes a call from a regulator can feel like the beginning of winter, slow at first, then relentlessly cold. I told James about the call. He said we needed to be prepared for anything and to keep records that showed transparency in our actions. He said the right words: measured, sensible, practical. He also said, with his usual steadiness, that if there were threats to Dylan's career, we should be willing to pay to end them. The suggestion made my stomach clench. The idea of paying someone to stop making trouble feels like buying silence. Yet, in practice, settlements can be instruments of protection rather than tools of shame. They are legal, pragmatic. They are not spectacle. I do not like the idea of paying to silence someone. It sits badly with my sense of justice. But I also know the cost of dragging a young man's career through months of insinuation and investigation. I know lawyers on both sides. Some see the courtroom as a stage and prolong the show for their own reasons. Others see it as a place to close wounds and keep families intact. My inclination, stubborn and maternal, is to end harm quickly and decisively when a child is involved. At the same time, I could not help thinking of Robert's gasp in the chapel, the moment his eyes connected to the man beside me. That gasp had been a pivot point in everyone's perception. What if, I wondered, the pivot became the beginning of a campaign to make money from notoriety? There are people who see a secret and dream of a payday. You do not defend a family with sentiment. You defend it with strategy. And the strategy had to begin with a conversation with Dylan that was not merely defensive. He needed to know why we had made the choices we had, but he also needed to know that I would not protect him at the cost of his autonomy. He had to be given the agency to choose. People who feel betrayed will. People who feel betrayed will do two things. They will lash out and they will ask for proof.
They will hold both actions up as equal measures of justice. So Dylan did both. He wanted proof of our intentions, and he wanted distance to think. That week, he removed my number from his favorites and left his apartment door ajar like a question mark. He called 3 times and left me messages I could not answer in the moment, because the work we were doing required a different kind of presence, one that did not react to provocation, but anticipated it. Before I could arrange a simpler, kinder meeting, the world of curiosity grew teeth. A regulator's letter arrived, not as a shout, but as a gray envelope with a polite header, asking for clarification on matters that, on paper, were complex and legal, but in the hands of someone eager for drama, easily framed as impropriety. A reporter I had never met began to call James under the pretense of fact-checking. A small investor forum began to debate with alarming relish whether the secret buyer constituted a conflict of interest. Someone had found an old charitable gift and used it like a marker on a map. I want to be clear about what that moment felt like, less like an attack than like a weather system rolling overhead, inexorable and indifferent to the people beneath it. I had spent years avoiding that kind of weather for my family. Now, because someone chose to prod at our seams in public, we were briskly packing up to weather a storm we had not invited. James told me what we all suspected. When curiosity tourists arrive, they bring professionals with them. Mark Vance, the lawyer representing Jessica, and increasingly her parents, was not a man who specialized in conversation. He specialized in making quiet things loud in the right rooms. He sent a letter that read like a tactful ultimatum. Jessica's side hinted at regulatory filings if we did not agree to a neutral conversation. Their tone was, at first glance, reasonable. The cadence of their words, however, suggested teeth beneath the velvet. I asked James to begin compiling a timeline: calls, emails, invoices, public mentions. He did it with the care of someone crafting a bridge. He insisted we stay above reproach. "We will not feed the fire with theatrics," he said. "We will be precise and unavoidable." I liked the phrase because it felt like engineering. Make the connection so solid that it cannot be misread. 2 months after the wedding, the first formal complaint landed with a regulator. It was not dramatic. It was procedural, the sort of thing that can be the beginning of a long winter. Preliminary requests for documents, for notes, for the names of trustees. It did not say guilty anywhere. It said, in the patient voice of bureaucracy, "Please assist us in understanding." That kind of voice is more frightening than the bluster of a hostile lawyer, because it obliges you to respond. We responded by doing what we had always done: get our papers in order, be transparent when transparency was appropriate, and maintain the privacy we still believed in. James coordinated with our counsel and the accountants to provide the requested information in a manner that was factual and limited to what was required. We refused to overshare. We refused to give anyone a narrative to weaponize.
That was one of the hardest choices of all, to answer enough to be compliant without providing a script for the gossip mill. Meanwhile, the social scene around Dylan narrowed. Former colleagues asked awkward questions in hallways. A client asked him, in the tone of someone measuring whether to stay or leave, "Do you still feel comfortable representing clients when there's a question about your family's interests?" It was a question meant to unsettle. I saw on his face the flicker of alarm, more for the implication than for his own truth. Jessica doubled down. She filed papers, not criminal but professional, suggesting that certain transfers might present conflicts. Her lawyer, Mark, framed this as an effort to protect transparency and Dylan's professional integrity. It was a curious phrasing, protecting transparency by making it a public spectacle. The logic of spectacle has a way of disguising ambition as public service. When people weaponize curiosity, they believe in a simple arithmetic. If you create enough suspicion, you gain leverage. Jessica had leverage. The public's appetite was the tool. And leverage can be turned into a cost. That was the arithmetic James and I understood all too well. I will not tell you I did not consider fighting this out in public. There were moments when the quiet woman in me wanted to stand up on a table and declare that we had, in fact, nothing to hide except our desire that Dylan grow up unshadowed. That impulse lasted less long than I expected. Thomas had always said that spectacle can be another kind of vanity. It solves nothing and leaves a mess. There is dignity in refusing to be a show. Instead, we prepared to do what Thomas would have done, remove danger as efficiently as possible. There are times when money is not simply money. It is a tool to steer a ship between rocks. Paying to end the noise is ethically complicated, but legally clean when it takes the shape of a settlement designed to end harassment and protect reputation. That was the frame James used, and I accepted it because the calculation was not about silencing truth,
but about stopping a cascade of actions that could destroy a young man's career. It was also a calculation I made because I had seen how small grievances metastasize when left unattended. I thought of Thomas's calm hands at the workbench, of the patient reaming of metal until the part fit perfectly, and I thought, when you have the means to fix a dangerous wobble, you fix it. You do not wait for a catastrophic failure. So we made an offer. It was not a dramatic deed done in a haze. I sat in James's office for most of an afternoon, watching him tabulate possibilities, counsel whispering options. We calculated an amount designed to be large enough to be meaningful, but not so large as to signal indulgence.
The number that became our offer, $5 million, was chosen with a single, ugly practicality. It would be significant enough to incentivize withdrawal of complaints and agreements to non-contact and to non-disparagement without bankrupting anything Thomas and I had built. To me, there was no thrill in dollar signs. There was only the desire to remove a hazard from my son's path. Before we offered that sum, James and I did something else. We compiled a dossier of our own, not of secrets, but of behavior, records showing Aguilar's invoices and the infiltration of certain private records, emails that suggested a pattern of aggressive interest, and the sequence of steps that linked curiosity to potential harm. It was not a plan to blackmail. It was a demonstration that the trouble being made was active, organized, and likely to escalate unless contained. When Mark's office received our offer, they responded the way courts of negotiation always do, with a mixture of calculation and theater. Mark asked for more time. He hinted that the money might not be enough unless additional terms were offered: public clarification, a joint statement, conditions on trustees. I could feel the room tilt in that direction if I let it. Demands beget demands. That is when I decided the settlement would be simple and clean. The terms were basic: withdrawal of any complaints and regulatory inquiries tied to Jessica's filings, with confirmation from the relevant authority, a mutual non-disparagement clause, a non-contact clause for a fixed period, and a confidentiality agreement about the terms. There was also a clause that required return of any improperly obtained documents. The settlement did not promise silence about facts that were already public. It promised an end to the campaign of inquiry and insinuation that had begun to hollow out our private life. People will ask why I did not demand a public apology, because an apology in a culture of attention often becomes another spectacle. I did not want to trade one public humiliation for another. I wanted a protective curtain to drop so that my son could breathe again. Negotiations took place like a tightrope walk. We met in a conference room in a downtown tower that smelled faintly of coffee and new paper. Mark had his own lawyer with him. James sat across from me, calm and attentive. There were moments when Mark attempted to raise other issues: fees, public statements, additional parties. I remember the sound of a pen tapping on paper like a metronome of impatience. At the most tense point, Mark asked, politely, if the offer included a clause that would keep Dylan from pursuing certain professional activities. The question was a test of wills disguised as prudence. I looked at Dylan then. He had insisted on being present, which surprised me, and I saw a man who had lost color and found it again. He was not confident, but he was present. No, I said, this is not about control.
This is about protecting him from a campaign that seeks to damage his career. We're not negotiating his life. My voice did not tremble. I had practiced these words, not in front of a mirror, but in my head for weeks. When the figure of $5 million appeared on the table as a firm line, Mark paused. He asked questions about timing and the payment mechanism. These are mundane things, but they are the points where ethics meet practice. We drafted a schedule: payment on execution of the agreement, with a clause for neutral third-party escrow to ensure compliance on both sides. The details were prosaic, but the effect was surgical. Jessica signed. I do not know if she felt vindicated. Maybe she did, privately, because a young person who sets out to correct a perceived wrong often needs the sense that the world heard them. Maybe she signed because she had been told that persistence pays. I do not pretend to understand fully what she felt. I only know that when the ink dried, the filings were withdrawn and the whispers slowed. And then something I had dreaded happened anyway. Dylan filed for separation. He told me, gently, that he needed time. He said he loved me and that he felt caught between us and the life he had chosen. The pain the filing caused was not legal to me in the same way it was personal. He was 30-something, and he was choosing. I had made a decision to protect his career. He had made a decision to preserve his sense of self. Was I angry? Yes, for a little while. Was I wounded? Yes. But these are human reactions, not the foundations of a plan. One of the things that is hard about being a mother, especially one who has tried to give her child autonomy, is accepting that sometimes autonomy will be exercised in ways that cause you grief. I swallowed that grief and let him go. It was one of the hardest things I have ever done. The divorce was not lurid. It was quiet and papered in pragmatism. There were no courtroom fireworks, no dramatic testimony. There were instead mediators and a lot of small decisions about who keeps what in an apartment that felt too empty for both of them. The most painful thing for me was watching Dylan look smaller in photos after the separation, less sure of how to stand in public when private life had become public currency. Time is kind, not in a sentimental way, but in a practical one. Distress fades around the edges if you do not feed it. Dylan moved into a small place with lots of light and bought new furniture that came with an instruction manual. He started to go to therapy, later telling me that the sessions were not cathartic so much as necessary maintenance, helping someone understand habits of thought that had been shaped by their childhood. They say people heal by replacing absence with presence. For Dylan, that came in the form of a relationship with someone older and steadier than Jessica in the ways that mattered. Sarah came into his life, slowly, without fireworks.
She was not glamorous, but she was kind in the way that repairs things, with patience, with practical attention, with an easy sense of authenticity. I met her at a small dinner after a 2-year gap, and I saw something soften in Dylan I had not seen since the wedding. Sarah didn't care about stories. She asked about his work and about his childhood and about Thomas, and she listened like someone who understood how to hold a history without making it a burden. That quality mattered. It meant she could love the man he was, not the one people told her to be interested in. As for Jessica, the settlement relieved the immediate pressure, but it did not become a moral win for anyone. She had, in the end, what she wanted in one sense: attention, conversation, a sort of vindication, and what she did not get was the lasting public shaming she had perhaps hoped for. People moved on. The news cycles turned. The period of intense focus ebbed and then receded into the background like a tide. I say all of this not to celebrate a victory, but to sketch a map of consequence. Settlements end campaigns. They do not erase the passage of how people were hurt in the time before the papers were signed. For my son, there was a wound that needed healing. For Jessica, there was a lesson about the boundary between curiosity and weaponization. For me, there was the knowledge that privacy, while fragile, had to be defended with both clarity and reserve. After the dust settled, I made another choice, one less about defense and more about legacy. The apartment we had lived in for 20 years became too large for a woman who had been spending nights on planes or at advisories, and I realized that holding on to it was partly nostalgia and partly a refusal to change with the life I had chosen. Thomas had loved that apartment for its light. I loved it for the years it contained, but love is not always the only reason to keep a thing. I wanted to do something that would turn a private fortune into public good in a manner that did not advertise me. So I sold the apartment, not with a parade, but with the quiet efficiency that suits a life spent in engineering and spreadsheets. The proceeds, after careful allocation for family and for a cushion for myself, were used to found the Thomas Fund. The Thomas Fund was not launched with a gala. It did not need one. It was a simple endowment aimed at supporting young engineers, the kind of people who made things and who were often overlooked in the splashier narratives of philanthropy. We offered small grants for prototype work, mentorship funds to connect young inventors with seasoned mentors, and scholarships for technical education. The fund carried Thomas's name because he would have wanted the work to carry forward, not his face. Setting up the fund felt like a reconciliation with the past. It allowed me to channel the resources we had amassed into something that outlived the petty noise.
It was, in a way, the most elegant response to convert conflict into possibility. I visited a few beneficiary labs, met young people who were passionate and nervous in equal measure, and felt a kind of quiet pleasure in being useful without spectacle. Not everyone agreed with my decision. There were commentators who thought we had bought privacy with money, and that was wrong. There were others who suggested I should have been louder in defense. I read the criticisms because I am not immune to scrutiny, but I did not let them determine my actions. The fund was not a performance for the critics. It was a practical tool for a conviction Thomas and I had shared. That work, good work, deserves help, and legacy is best measured by the people you lift, not the headlines you make. Then came Santa Fe. The city pulled at me with slow breath and a color I had not known I yearned for. I wanted light that felt honest, a rhythm of life slower than the city's impatient pulse. I wanted adobe walls and a courtyard where morning coffee could be accompanied by birds that seemed to praise the day without an audience. I wanted a place where I could be visible by choice rather than by accident. Moving felt like unloading a coat I had worn for decades. I brought a few boxes of Thomas's tools, a portfolio of his old notebooks, and a careful selection of family photographs. I kept a small study where I could meet with the funds board and a garden that required only moderate attention. Santa Fe offered quiet and, more importantly, distance. Not distance to avoid responsibility, but distance to choose perspective. The city also offered me something else, the chance to be a different kind of woman in my son's life. I was no longer the anonymous figure in a polished chapel. I was a neighbor who baked bread sometimes and who volunteered at community workshops. I became someone Dylan could visit without the story following him like a hound. Visits were slow at first, then more frequent as the seasons turned. He introduced Sarah to my new kitchen and watched with a little pride as she and I argued over the proper way to spice a stew. Those small domestic scenes were, to me, a quiet kind of healing. Time, therapy, and the steady presence of a partner who listened did something practical to Dylan. They restored him to himself. He began to take on projects he had once shelved, to speak at a couple of conferences without flinching, and to see his life not as a ledger of what his parents had made, but as a composition he would write. We spoke, eventually, in honest ways about choices and consequences. He forgave in the ways people do, slowly, by making new memories and by choosing to anchor his sense of worth in his own labor. Did I miss the intimacy we once had? At times, but parent-child relationships are not static. They are contracts that must be renegotiated as children age. For a while, we had to accept that the terms had shifted. In time, they found a new basis of trust.
As for Jessica, we crossed paths on occasion at industry events. She was not a villain in my story. She was a person who had been ambitious in ways that hurt others. We exchanged polite words, and once she paused long enough to say she was sorry for the hard things that had happened, though she did not ask for forgiveness in a way that demanded absolution. It was sufficient. People change in increments. Sometimes apology is a small one. I learned something through all of this that I had suspected but had not fully grasped. Invisibility is not the same as cowardice, and visibility is not the same as virtue. There is an art to choosing how much of yourself you allow into the world. Toms and I chose a certain measure of invisibility because it fit our values and our desire for our son's autonomy. That choice was not malice. It was a kind of protective selfishness experienced in the language of parenting. When people asked why I did not tell Dylan earlier, or why we had not prepared him for the possibility that curiosity could have teeth, I had to be honest. I had been protecting him in the way one protects a child learning to swim, by lowering them into the pool and waiting to let go until you trust the water and the child. Sometimes that trust is misplaced. Sometimes it is called into question. Parenting is an experiment where you are constantly adjusting variables. I do not suggest that anyone emulate our choices blindly. Each family must decide the balance between exposure and privacy for themselves. But I will say this, when you make that choice, you should prepare for the consequences. Protecting privacy requires defense when others decide to pry. It requires evidence, legal counsel, and a willingness to make pragmatic decisions that may feel uncomfortable in moral terms, but are designed to protect people you love. That was our calculus, and imperfect as it may have been, it worked to keep a man's career intact and to preserve the possibility of repair. There is, finally, a small lesson about power I keep returning to. Power without spectacle is quieter, but it is not necessarily powerless. It is the ability to act when needed without making every action a performance. To some, employing wealth to end a campaign of aggression looks like capitulation. To me, it looked like duty, using the tools at hand to stop harm. The settlement was not a victory of spite. It was a measured instrument of protection. What I chose in the end was not revenge, but thriving. I did not want to spend the rest of my life proving things to people who would always prefer drama to complexity. I wanted to build something durable, to give to young inventors, to make sure Thomas's work mattered beyond our time. I wanted to live in a place where the light was honest and where I could be present to my son without the glare of gossip. If you had been in my shoes, would you have offered $5 million to stop the noise?
Would you have chosen to protect a career at the cost of a marriage? These are questions I get often, and they are complicated because they are not only legal or financial, they are moral in the rawest sense. So I ask you now, what would you have done? Would you have stood and let the public decide? Or would you have bought a curtain to close the stage? Tell me in the comments. There is no judgment here, only a conversation I am still having with myself. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who loves complicated family dramas the way we sometimes love a difficult novel.